So I am a historian and sociologist and political activist. I have historically been active in direct political work around anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism and anti-sanctions work, primarily in the US context, and supporting the Palestinian struggle. And for most of the last 10 years I have been living in for most of the past 14 years I've been living in the Arab region. Most of the last 10 years I've been living in Tunisia, and I work on issues of decolonization, post-colonial development, heterodox thinking about post-colonial development, like the paths that were suppressed all over the post-colonial and peripheral world, especially the role of agriculture in sustainable and sovereign development. And I've also been working on ecological and climate issues at some level for a very long time. It's always been a part of my work, and more recently I've been more directly working on it. So I tell people this often, the Green New Deal book was a bit of an accident. When the Green New Deal of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appeared in the United States, it quickly reconstituted the American, and unfortunately therefore a lot of global climate discussion around kind of these very social democratic, reformist and opportunist and imperialist therefore modes of politics, right? And so it was the entire discussion suddenly concentrated around how to carry out environmental politics within the framework of electing social democrats into office, right? And so I perceive this as very potentially damaging for the majority of the planet, and also even ineffective on its own terms. So I thought, okay, well, first of all, these people are not really social democrats in the first place, but second of all, their programs are never going to work. And third of all, just as importantly as first of all and second of all, these programs are imperialist, right? They have no concern for the rest of the planet. They have no concern for the fact that people in the North have an obligation to confront what the North is doing to the rest of the planet, ecologically speaking, socially speaking, economically speaking, politically speaking. So I tried to intervene in the debate, and there was a suppression of some of my attempted interventions. They were like, well, it's not appropriate to critique the reformist opportunist programs. I was like, well, it seems to me pretty opportunist then to refuse to critique the opportunism. So I said, okay, well, actually it's very important to have an intervention that can reflect the lessons I've learned living in the third world for most of my adult life, and can bring those more adequately into the center of especially but not only the North American debate. And so that's why I wrote the book. So first, I think we have to always keep in mind what is the historical origins of social democracy, right? Social democracy, primarily a northern phenomenon, although it was also, you can say variants of it occurred in their various ways in developmentalist states in the global south that were kind of related to the force of global democracy. But these were political and economic containment procedures, right, worldwide. I mean, even the best of them, these were ways of containing radical national liberation. They were ways of containing communism. And they were ways of preserving, to some degree, internal capitalist class structures, and also the process of accumulation on a world scale. Like, that is the origins of social democracy, right? Once we understand that social democracy is not something leftists should fight for. Actually, it happens by itself, but from the ruling class when leftists are fighting for something much more radical. So there's no reason to fight for it, especially because social democracy, because it remains a capitalist mode of administering the social formation, rests on continued exploitation, and therefore, as a communist, I'm against exploitation in the North and in the South. And therefore, we need to be very clear with people that we do not want a world with exploitation, and this is the problem with social democracy, is that it remains capitalist, it remains the production of commodities for means of accumulation on a world scale and continued growth. And this is why it is something to be opposed. It also historically rests on very large and substantial value drain from the south to the north. I mean, this is the basis, not just the basis of the original accumulation that allowed for these so-called developed industrial democracies to distribute wealth to their populations in northern social democracy, right? But this was also the basis of continued social democracy in the north was massive value extraction, which continued even during the best periods of third world development. I mean, there was always wealth extraction from the periphery to the core, right? And again, if as a communist, I'm opposed to the wealth flows that go in from the periphery to the core. So, in principle, green or not, social democracy is not something to fight for. Thinking about the climate crisis in demographic terms could be very dangerous, because this is, it's usually a northern argument to claim that there's a southern overconsumption of resources, whereas the fundamental problem is the overconsumption of resources engineered by northern monopoly capital, right? So I think this is very important to keep in mind. In terms of shifts in production, you know, I always, this question in various forms comes up, and everything that is would make the world beautiful right now seems impossible, period. Without exception, in almost every country on the planet, right? I mean, it's, we have to recognize that, right? I think that, first of all, that can't be an obstacle in terms of political thinking, because that's actually an internalization of a defeat, or it's an internalization of an internalization at the level of defeat at the level of ideology, right? So we have to insist that, okay, this is not, none of this way of organizing the world is historically necessary, and a lot of it is very new in many ways, right? So I think this is the first part, is that we have to, not in a silly way, but we have to resist that at an ideological level and say, okay, I mean, as a, you know, although I don't live in America, right, we're like universal health care, which I think you guys have some sort of variety of in Turkey, actually, but for us in America, we're like universal health care. This would be a total miracle for us, right? We're like, imagine that you pay even just €100 a month for good health, good, free, basically good health care in the United States. This would be a miracle for the, like, it's unthinkable almost to achieve this victory in the United States context, right? So this is, you know, as soon as the imagination is contained by, the political horizon is contained by realism, then you already lose. I mean, for agriculture, a transition to a much more sustainable form of agricultural production, which would still have probably industrialized seeding and some element of tilling maybe, and certainly industrialized harvesting. This transition, I think, is relatively easy. I mean, technically speaking, we could carry out on a worldwide level in 15 years, I think. Most of the, you know, most people who are actually actively involved in agriculture have already some knowledge of non-industrial farming techniques, right? The place where that knowledge has truly been lost is in the north. But, you know, even in places where I don't know how much the relative balance of agriculture, heavily industrialized versus not in Turkey, for example, but most people who, especially older farmers, would have some knowledge of how to do agroecological sustainable techniques of farming. So it's just a question of shifting the political, the macroeconomics, the policy environment to make it so that that becomes a better way, that makes it a more logical way of farming, which basically means that you have to actually reward people for the protection of the natural environment, right? Which, I don't mean monetizing nature, because we want non-commodified social relations, but the labor involved in the reproduction of the natural environment needs to receive its reward in the global distribution of reward for labor, right? That's fundamental. Now, for industrialization also, right, I mean, there are certain things that you can just do. You can mandate that, quality requirements for cars. You can mandate, you know, old cars from like the 50s and 60s. Some of them would last for 40 years. I mean, you still find them on the road again, I don't know so much about Turkey, but you find cars from 40 or 50 years ago on the road in the Arab region, right? Because these are actually, they're not made of plastic, they're built to last. You can mandate that a phone can either be easily repaired or will last, give it a warranty of 10 years, and then it's going to be engineered so it will last 10 years, right? Instantly you're lighting, with procedures like this, you're lightening the industrial load on the planet in a very simple way. I mean, you can say that you could somehow create cost-price structures with price engineering so that chairs are made out of wood and not out of metal, right? And you've just shifted a whole sector of production from industrial to non-industrial, right? Just like that, right? So it's you know, I think we have to think in those terms, and once we think in those terms, then you can easily, especially the North, you can easily reduce the industrial load of the North, which is the main problem, the main culprit, right? I mean, it's also, the South is getting there as well, the rising middle class in the South. Of course, it's a problem, but it's not the central problem, right? Most of this type of shifts are relatively more labor intensive, and we have a global crisis of underemployment or unemployment, right? So you're reshifting the way production works. You're re-engineering the social patterns of production so that you make it far more sustainable. And again, a lot of it could be done very quickly, right? How much of it, I don't really know. You know, I think it would require society-wide experimentation, right? Also, how much industrialization do we want? That's not even a question in our societies. Like, how much industrialization is the right amount of industrialization? That's not even, no one's even discussing that anymore, right? But it seems like it's a logical question. Like, there's certain things I personally certainly want to be industrialized, you know, camera technology and high-speed rail and computers and so forth, and why not bicycle manufacturing and so forth. And there's other things like if people can make them by hand in sufficient quantities, like chairs, like that's cool questions, right? One are the commitments that come from the Paris Accords, and those are, some of them are being reached by some countries, some of them not by others. Certainly it won't be enough. It's, at this point, it's 2 degrees of Celsius seems quite inevitable on a worldwide basis. Even, and probably will go higher than that at the current trajectory. So it's definitely, what's being planned for is insufficient. I mean, the question of whether the capitalism could reduce carbon dioxide emissions faster is kind of a complicated question. I mean, you know, capitalism will do it if there is sufficient pressure from worldwide ecological movements, essentially. Then capitalism will shift its metabolism to a lower carbon dioxide output. I mean, and it will still be capitalism, right? So the question, I think, is also, this might be a bit more important to focus on, is what is the actual program of capitalism, given that it is not being pressured? Like, how does the ruling class see its own rational interests? And it doesn't care that much about global warming on the whole, right? It's planning basically for at least 2 to 3 degrees Celsius of worldwide average heating, with substantial risks of runaway warming. I mean, this is currently understood to be the predictable consequence of the current trends in carbon dioxide emissions. And the ruling class in the North and in a lot of the South, but the South doesn't really have a lot of leverage, frankly, it doesn't seem to care all that much. It says that's acceptable, right? I mean, part of that is because the North is already more, is colder than the South, and therefore agricultural areas won't suffer as much, and there's more room for more space physically and economically for adaptation. So they basically think they can deal with it. So of course there could be pressure put on the capitalist governments to reduce much more quickly carbon dioxide emissions, but this will only occur in response to a vast external pressure, right? And so this is why precisely the program to mount an external pressure on the capitalist governments should not limit itself to limited goals, because in any case they're not going to implement anything socially rational without massive external pressures. We should fight for good goals, not just reformist goals. It helps a little bit to step back and to keep in mind as we approach the problem that we should always start with just a certain wider understanding of what is labor, right? I mean, because you know, I understand there is a labor movement, right? Of course, organized in unions and often in the industrial sector, but also potentially in you know, in the service sector. There's also agricultural unions, right? Of course, so this is what's often understood by labor, but there's a lot of labor going on, right? I mean, as most of all learned from the Marxist feminist theorists, the work of the reproduction of society is also labor. It's a relationship to the means of production, namely what they're reproducing is labor itself, right? In the same way, a lot of what is called kind of, at least in the US environmental discourse, like indigenous, kind of like indigenous environmental movements. Actually, what they're reproducing is the natural environment, right, through labor, right? I think that's an important clarification, not because it directly addresses your question, which I understand it doesn't, but just because it equips us to more, I think it equips us to enter the discussion and push back against people who are like, that's labor over there, and that's the environment over there, right? Whereas there's a lot of mixing between the two, and there's a lot of labor that is invisible, right? There's a lot of labor that isn't really being compensated for under a capitalist under capitalist social relations, but it's still occurring, right? So it's important to say, okay, there's a lot of labor, but the problem is that labor is not rewarded under capitalism, or is not quantified under capitalism. That's the first thing. I mean, also, but in terms of the, you know, the separation between labor and the environmental movement, I mean, first of all, the, you know, the conditions of labor are, of course, I think, part of labor, right? So the ecological conditions of labor are part of the labor movement, right? Because they not only do they affect the ecological environment on a broad scale, which workers need to survive, right? Workers need the good earth to be able to survive. Everyone, of course, workers know that. But also in a narrower sense, right, the localized pollution also affects workers' health, right? Which, of course, workers are also very well aware of, right? But there's often not another option, right? So a fight for ecology is also a fight for the social rights of labor in sites of labor, right? So I don't think the two are necessarily separate if we have if we have the correct vocabulary. And I mean, I know that's, I think, to my understanding, it's been used, for example, in the struggle against the Brazilian asbestos ship. I mean, this was very operative in some of the struggles in Turkey, right? So I think there's not often such a separation between environmental justice and labor, except maybe at the often at the terminological level as part of the problem, but it's also reproduced analytically and also in terms of organizing, often by racist northern Marxists who are like, okay, you know, labor is only working in a factory. Okay, this is not a serious thing. There's another aspect, though, that I think is more difficult, and that we have to keep in mind also, is that, you know, part of the reason the South had a rapid industrialization in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right, both under import substitution, but also even more so under export-oriented industrialization, right, is because the North relocated its dirtiest industries to the South, and also relocated all kinds of industries to the South, where ecological protections are much weaker. Right? So the advantage of the South was that it could, basically the Southern bourgeois developmentalist governments were able to, in a sense, ecologically exploit or cut into the ecological social well-being of their workforce, right? And that was what enabled industrialization, and kind of is the foundation of us even being able to discuss this question, in a sense, of how to deal with this fact of this seeming contradiction between the Southern labor movement and the Southern ecological movement, right? So this is important to keep in mind. Now, how to deal with that at a strategic level when capital has the capacity to always shift. So countries with looser labor regulations mean you need to reconstitute labor international, communist labor internationalism on a worldwide scale, right? That's my recommendation. I mean, I don't know how to do that, but I think that's like something we have to do, right? Because otherwise, capital, monopoly capital, is just going to play national workforces against one another, not only on the question of wages, but also on the question of the under-reproduction of the natural environment. You know, women's maternity leave is in effect, it's a social, a paid maternity leave. I don't think we don't have much paid maternity leave in North America, but in Europe there's paid maternity leave, which is a social wage in effect, right? The society has decided that there's a part of the society's surplus should be allocated towards women when they have babies, right? It's totally legitimate, right? It should be totally expanded to childcare as well, right? So that, I think that logic could also be extended to the environment. It's just that we have to consider that the reproduction and care and safeguarding and upkeep of the environment is also a fundamental task of human societies, and that it is labor on the same scale as building a car or dismantling a ship for metal scrap. I learned a lot about it over the last week during being here with a lot of people who are actively struggling in the ecological movement. And it seems that there is, especially recently, there's a huge interest in it, and a huge concern, especially around, all the mega projects that are carried out under the term development. I mean, it's clear that there's a massive encroachment on the natural environment going on through a great deal of the mega projects over the last 10 years. Actually, that's when I started coming to Turkey, is the last 12 years, and you see these massive transformations in the built environment, which obviously has massive ecological consequences and repercussions, right? This level of so-called modernization does not come free when it comes from the perspective of the natural environment. I mean, so it seems to me that, actually, I mean, I don't know the details, but it does seem to me that ecology is actually very widespread as part of various progressive movements in Turkey as compared to other countries. I mean, I know that, ecology has been very present in the Kurdish movement historically and in the present day. I know it's very present in the plans and the programs and the policies of HDP. I know, outside of the Kurdish left, I'm less aware of how prevalent it is. But, I've been hearing about some very interesting struggles going on in Izmir, like I said, localized resistance against mega dams countrywide over the last 10 years. So I think there's a lot going on. The political environment is horrible, of course, where any type of resistance against ecological devastation gets tagged in ways that are meant to jail or otherwise prevent the participants from continuing on their work. So I think it's, there's a lot of difficulties ahead. And yeah, so in terms of recommendations, I couldn't offer any recommendations. I think it's very brave what people